work for it, ride for it. I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning, I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
We are very pleased to be joined today on the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast by Samuel Stein, author of the book Capital City, Gentrification in the Real Estate State, put out by Verso Press in 2019. So welcome, Sam. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. I just got to say, for listeners who haven't heard of the book, that it was passed to me this year by a fellow organizer and activist, and it was just a great gift. It really helped for me to make sense of things I've lived through in my life and issues that we're working on, and I've heard other people have similar experiences with the book. So just wanted to start by giving you a salute and saying thank you, and then recommending folks listening to this follow up and pick up the book.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate that.
Hell yeah. Can we start just by maybe asking a grounding question? How did you become interested in these topics, and why are you so passionate about housing justice?
Sure. I mean, there's probably a lot of ways I can answer that, but the clearest one is that I got evicted. And that's how a lot of people come to housing, tenants' rights, and gentrification. I cared about those things before, but I was working as a union researcher and organizing campaigns at the time. And so my main focus was on wages and benefits and union protection, and all the good stuff that comes from that. And I cared about housing on a personal level, certainly, but in the city as a whole. And I cared about the life of my city, New York. But it really got personal when I was evicted. This was 2007. I was staying in a former teacher's apartment when the two of them were both away in different places. They needed somebody to stay in their place. So me and my then girlfriend moved in. And the landlord at some point decided that he wanted us out, that we were illegal subletters, that the people on the lease hadn't gotten the permission of him to sublet to us, so we were illegal tenants. And according to the law, that was true, and it was legal for him to evict us, and he did. The backstory, though, is that this guy was just getting out of jail for attempted murder of the downstairs neighbor and arson of the building, which he had attempted. He torched the building. And he tried to hire somebody to put a lethal dose in her heroin. And that guy kept the building just by signing a piece of paper that gave it to his brother while he went to jail for trying to kill everybody in it, got out of jail, got the building back. And the first thing he does is evict me and anybody else who, didn't have the right kind of lease. And of course, the people on the lease weren't going to get the permission of the landlord. He was in jail for just trying to kill them and all their neighbors. So that kind of smacked me on the head that even in New York City, which has some of the strongest tenant protections in the city, even in that rent-stabilized apartment that I could afford, landowners, property owners have tremendously more rights than renters, and it gets manifested through a million different forms of violence every day. So that kind of got me into it. Eventually, I moved from the union movement toward the tenant movement. At the same time, I was studying urban planning, and that kind of gave me a framework for understanding the bigger picture of how and why this was all happening.
Wow. That's an extreme wake-up call right there. Where like a lot of people experience those dynamics, but that's a really incredible story.
Yeah, it doesn't get much clearer than the attempted murdering landlord using a legal loophole to evict you.
Right, for real though, that kind of lays things bare. We just came out of a multi-year struggle in Minneapolis around one of the larger and more abusive landlords in the city, and he actually was just sentenced to the workhouse for some illegal activities dealing with his buildings. But through that campaign, I think a lot of people woke up to that reality that you have folks in the propertied class who are really committing just acts of violence and bold acts of corruption and getting all the privileges inside of the legal and political systems, where you have, hardworking folks just trying to survive who are really getting the short end of the stick. So I think that's something that resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, this country is set up to protect property ownership. That's one of the fundamental cores of its legal, principles and constitution. And, that can be abstracted into this kind of moral right. But in the day-to-day, it means a ton of inequality, a ton of violence. And some of that is enacted by the property owners themselves. Some of that is enacted by police on behalf of property owners. Some of that is enacted by other elements of the state in order to protect and keep elevated the property values, to keep the rents and bank payments flowing.
Yeah, absolutely. In a broad sense, just the main subject of the book, gentrification, I feel like this is something that people all across the country are experiencing. It's on the tip of a lot of people's tongues and in people's mind, and it's kind of a word that's crept into kind of the popular culture discourse. So I wanted to ask you two questions that you pose at the beginning of one of your chapters, and just to talk about what is happening in our cities and why are they becoming so expensive.
Right. And so gentrification is the word that we have for it. It's a clunky, multisyllabic word. It comes out of the English context, where I think it might be a little bit more intuitive, because there they have a thing that they call the gentry. And we have that here, but we don't usually call it that. The gentry as like the landed aristocracy, the people whose wealth comes not from working, not even necessarily from owning a business, but from owning land, and either collecting rents off of that or making a speculative profit off its sale. So the gentrification is the transformation of our urban spaces into places, from places for the working class and built by the working class, into places for the gentry, for the landowning class. So that's what's happening in a lot of our cities. It's certainly not happening across the board in the country. There's a lot more of this country that's suffering through deep disinvestment, which in a lot of ways is the opposite of gentrification, money leaving an area.
Yeah.
But in particular, segments of cities in many states in this country, we're seeing not just like a slow change, but a really rapid transformation. And cities like New York and San Francisco become kind of the poster children, but it's kind of medium-sized cities that are seeing the fastest increase in rent, the fastest decline in affordability. I wouldn't be surprised if the Twin Cities were high on that metric as well.
Yeah, I've seen some studies that say that, and it definitely feels like that.
Right. So then the question is, why? Why is this happening? And why is it happening in so many places at the same time? It's not like, the North is getting more expensive, but the South is getting cheaper, or I don't know. There's no like rational explanation that shows certain places becoming more affordable as others get more expensive, though there certainly is a decline in property values. But even in those places, the rents are far outpacing people's incomes. So what's going on? We've got incomes more or less flat in this country for everybody but the top. And so people's wages have not gone up significantly over the last couple decades, even as we're approaching closer to full employment. We've seen property values go up and properties changing hands at a really rapid pace. And a lot of times it's not just a homeowner selling to a homeowner, it's banks buying out homeowners and then transforming them into investment properties. And then we've seen the rents skyrocket. In those properties and in others generally, rents have gone up something like 200% in the last 20 years overall. And there's a lot of explanations for why this is happening. The most common ones that you hear have to do with a mismatch between supply and demand in cities. that there are certain places where a lot of people are moving to, and there's just not enough housing in them. And so as a result, the price goes up. That is true in some places, that's less true in others. But there's certainly a factor there, especially if you look not just at the total supply and the total demand, but the particular supply that exists and where the demand is coming from. There's a lot of places that have, plenty of expensive housing, but not a lot of cheap housing, and there's a huge demand for that. That supply is not being met in the same way that the supply for luxury housing is being met. So that's one explanation. Another explanation is kind of a changing cultural attitudes around cities, that now cities are cool. Young people who are graduating from college want to move to them. You've got these clusters of technological and other kinds of innovation in this country, and that's driving gentrification. That's also true. It is true that there's a sort of cultural change in what's valued, and people like mass transit, and they like bikes, and they like smaller living. They also can't afford bigger living, so that's kind of like a cause and effect question, but that's a factor. The thing that's left out of these mainstream explanations, which again are not wrong, but they're just not enough, is that there's been a complete change in how global capital is invested that is changing the shape of our cities at the local level. And what I mean by that is global capital, global investment, has shifted towards real estate as the predominant growth strategy. So at this time in history, something like 60% of global capital, if it's invested in something you can touch rather than like a financial derivative, it's invested in real estate, in land, buildings, and particularly in housing. 3/4 of that investment is in housing rather than agriculture or industry or any other kind of land use. So the world's richest people and the world's richest institutions have decided that real estate is the future for them. And they're moving their money away from other more productive industries and into land wherever they can make a profit. And that profit is generated by capitalizing on the difference between what land will rent or sell for now and what it will rent or sell for if there's a change made. If you can invest a bunch of money, knock down what's there, build up something new that will sell for more. If you can change the laws that protect tenants and get rid of those, well, you can rent for more after that as well. And so global capital is trying to close that gap that exists in as many places as it can. That's kind of the fundamental change that I think is essential to understanding what's going on and why it's happening in so many different places at the same time.
Can you talk about the particular racial and class dynamics, how that's playing out in the American context? Like, I think I heard you say before that gentrification is the third movement in a distinct phase of capital flows. So, like, kind of putting that into the context of white flight, suburbanization, divestment, could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So what I argue is that we should all understand gentrification not as a unique phenomenon that can happen at random anywhere at any time, but as the third phase in a very long process of investment in a place, disinvestment from that place, and then reinvestment in it. And gentrification is that third phase in a predatory way, predatory reinvestment in space that has been disinvested. So the first phase is investment. Money goes into these places in the first place. Infrastructure is built out that allows for development and human habitation and commerce and all those other things. Rail lines, streets, electric grids, water systems, all that stuff costs money. A lot of that investment is done by the public sector, by the state. Following that, there's private investment into real estate that tends to trace those infrastructural lines. So as a railroad is built out, the value of that land goes up tremendously. People build out housing in the area, and they might even build out very expensive housing in places that wealthier people desire to live in. Over time, however, capitalism is a very unstable system. And it's not just subject to historical crises, as in things go boom and bust at particular time. It's also always what we say in my discipline, geography. It's uneven development. Money moves from one place to another in search of greater returns. And so there's a phase that any gentrified neighborhood has gone through where money that had moved into a place suddenly moves out, or over time moves out. Doesn't have to be so sudden. And what that can look like is banks refusing to lend to the owners of those properties, and then the owners not having enough money coming in through rents to make the necessary upkeep on them. And slowly they start to fall apart and become dangerous. And at that point, the owner might abandon it altogether. They might burn it down and collect insurance money. They might sell it to somebody who's going to chop it up into a million tiny apartments and then ultimately walk away from it after that. And this doesn't just happen, again, at random. It often happens in tandem with government policy. So in the US, we had policies of redlining, which was a federally initiated policy of banks to use their power to divest from certain areas and invest in others. And most of the time that meant divesting from central city locations where African Americans and recent immigrants had congregated and made a life for themselves, or even integrated neighborhoods. Money would come out of there, banks would no longer lend there, and instead they'd lend to exclusionary, white, usually suburban areas, either on the peripheries of the city or in new suburbs outside of them. So that's when we have the structural disinvestment from urban spaces that then maybe 30, 40 years later creates the conditions for gentrification.
Yeah.
By that point, you've got properties that were at one point hot commodities that then became very cheap and hard to sell. Somebody can invest in those again, bring them back up to the standards they were at before, or tear them down and build something else and reinvest in that space. But this is done in a way that makes it unaffordable for those people who suffered through the long period of disinvestment, who stuck with the neighborhood, who built up institutions to keep it running, to keep it safe, to keep life going in those places. They can no longer afford to live there once it becomes obvious to investors that they can make a significant amount of profit. So that's how gentrification capitalizes on a long period of investment and disinvestment in city neighborhoods.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. I think it's important to keep bringing to the surface. I wanted to, from there, ask you, this is a dynamic that has been coming up in my own life and I've seen come up in community spaces here in Minneapolis is how do you balance the fault, or how do you assign responsibility to the various kind of classes that contribute to gentrification? So most people, they think of gentrification, they think of new white people with more money and coffee shops and, hipsters or whatever, the people who are consuming these newly invested in neighborhoods. And then also people pointing rightly to the global capital and to the landlords and to the owning class as, making the investments that are really causing and creating and profiting from the gentrification. How do you look at that dynamic? What responsibility, or how do you engage with the folks who are consuming the gentrification? And then how do you engage with and organize against the capital that's, making these investments and profiting?
Right. It's a two-sided process that academics over the year have come to call both the production and consumption side of gentrification, which matches the way that we talk about the production of any kind of commodity. Somebody produces it, somebody else consumes it. There's an economic transaction between them that's mediated by all sorts of different parties. And that's going on in gentrification as well. And it's a really good question. How do you assign blame? And really, what do you do politically? In terms of understanding how it works, I think there has been a long and largely unproductive debate over the production versus the consumption explanation. I think it should be fairly obvious that both have to exist for this thing to work. The producers of gentrification are the banks that invest in space in that predatory kind of way. the developers who knock down affordable housing and replace it with stuff that's far too expensive for the people who lived there before, the landlords who raise the rent on long-term tenants. Those are the producers. The consumers are the people you talked about who move into those neighborhoods, who are looking to live in that kind of space. And their kind of cultural markers change over the years. In sometimes in places they're hippies, in other places they're hipsters, and both really have to be there. So if there's production side without consumption side, you're going to have a newly built up place that nobody moves into, and the project fails. If you have the consumption side without the production side, then you're going to have a lot of unmet demand. So in most of these cases, you have both. As a Marxist, I think there's much more politically that we can focus on around the production side of any kind of economic transaction. And Karl Marx wrote about how the consumption side is easy for anybody to see. You go to a store, you see the price of something, and that seems like the whole economic story. This milk costs $4. I purchase it. It must have cost $4 to produce. But there is this whole other side, which he called the hidden abode of production, which has its own rules and its own deep sets of exploitation that are fundamental before you even get to the product to the market. And so I focus in my book much more on the in the production side than on the consumption side. But I've also seen a lot of really annoying people who are obviously buying into gentrification, kind of getting rid of their own guilt by saying, no, it's not the consumption side, it's just the production side. Just focus on the banks and the landlords and the developers, and kind of ignoring their own part in it. And I've also seen the opposite, which is people like just focusing on how annoying brunching hipsters are without noticing the landlord that put that fancy restaurant in that building in the first place, and kicked out the community center or whatever was there before. So you really have to have both sides of the analysis politically. But I'd say that it's all too easy to fall into the consumption side, and it takes a little bit more work. And I think there's more reward in really emphasizing the politics of production in gentrification.
Absolutely. I really appreciate it. And one of the reasons why I was so excited by your book is because I experienced the consumption side. I'm from a part of Minneapolis, Northeast Minneapolis, which was historically a kind of Eastern European working class blue collar section of town that has been really aggressively gentrified. And everybody in my life, even who don't use the word gentrification, notice it, they're hurt by it, they struggle with it. And so often working class people, like you said, the production side is hidden from us and we are mystified. And then we put all our energy into, trying to fight the hipster or to share my own experience. Do you have pedal pubs in New York? Do you know what that is?
I don't know what that is.
It's like this thing that was like a feature of gentrification here where you can like 6 to 8 people or whatever will rent this like group bike that's like a bar, and then they like bike around the neighborhood getting drunk and hooting and hollering at people and stuff.
Wait,
and
you're like to drink and ride a bicycle at the same time?
Yeah, but it's like a weird bike where it's like you're around you're powering like a 4-wheel vehicle that's like open to the public, but I'm realizing now that it was like a politicizing moment for me when I was so frustrated that I tried to provoke a physical confrontation with a particularly annoying group on a pedal pub, because it just felt like, who are you? Why are you here in our neighborhood? What is this, And then I realized that I'm missing the real enemy, I'm missing the real cause. I'm not going to get to the root of the problem. So I appreciate the Marxist perspective that, looks at it more structurally. And then on the same hand, I got to recognize that it could be tempting for me to kind of soothe my own guilt by not acknowledging the dynamics on the ground, because I also now live in a part of South Minneapolis where I'm a gentrifier, So I think a lot of people are struggling with those nuances, and it's good to open up that dialogue.
Yeah. And I'm still kind of mystified by what a pedal pub is.
I feel you. Sorry, I had to drop that one on you.
It does sound deeply annoying. And there's a material consequence. People lose the space of the street to a bunch of drunk people driving around and having a great time. And, people should be able to have fun in whatever way they want, but you are actually changing the character of the place. And so if people are ignorant to the way that they're participating in gentrification, that's really a problem. It's not like, the term gentrifier itself is not one that I use, I don't think, anywhere in the book, because I think it often does this mystification. It blames the most visible element rather than going a few steps back. So, the tenant who moves into the neighborhood like you is playing a role in gentrification, but it's not the same role as the landlord, who is managing this property in the first place. And then what you do once you get there really does matter. There's a lot of lip service, I think, often in New York City, kind of community organizing politics to being friendly, shopping local, all that. That's important. But organizing with neighbors against gentrification is more important than anything else you could do, and really changes the meaning of your place in that place once you take those actions.
Absolutely. And in my experience, there's also many working class people who are suffering and need the analysis of the production side and need to organize. Like, thinking of myself, I call myself a gentrifier, but I can barely pay the rent. I'm struggling to pay the rent. And I find that when you get out of that dynamic of, just because I'm new, that means I'm a gentrifier, and you start to connect with your neighbors and talk about your material conditions and build community and politicize, it opens up much more space.
Right. There's a project in New York City that I'm really inspired by called the Crown Heights Tenants Union. And that's not the neighborhood I live in, but I have a lot of friends who have participated in this thing for years. And it was an active attempt at organizing all tenants in this neighborhood, kind of across the multiple lines that had divided a potential tenant movement, which included race and religion most famously, but also kind of like the newcomer versus old timer dynamic, and the race and class dynamics of that, to say we're not all equal and we're not going to pretend that we are, but we are all tenants and we literally have the same enemy. Like, the same guy is trying to raise our rents, and they're using the fact that I'm here to raise your rent. And so the potential gentrifying tenants are kind of refusing that role and organizing with their neighbors, making eviction blockades, taking on particular landlords who have been especially egregious in the neighborhood, and trying, I don't know if they'll get there, but trying to establish a collective bargaining agreement between the tenants union and the landlords, modeled on a labor union kind of model. So there are ways that you can break out of that consumption dynamic and really fight with your neighbors against gentrification and against everyone's collective enemy.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. That's exciting. I wanted to get into another dynamic that I found really useful in your book. In the organizing work that I've been involved in, probably for the last decade, it's put me into contact with a group of people that I didn't even really know exist, which was kind of the city bureaucracy, the city planning department and the consultants who work with the city planning department and this whole profession of urban planners, and you talk about the ways that these folks function. You talk about kind of the ideology that impacts and restrains their work. And I found two pieces I wanted to ask you to talk about. Could you talk about the property contradiction and the capitalist democracy contradiction and how these show up in urban real estate?
Yeah, so I got that language from a book called Planning the Capitalist City by Richard Fogelsong, which is a really excellent book from the early 80s that looks at the first few hundred years of development in the US and the role of planning, especially in the 19th century. And he identifies those two contradictions as really fundamentally framing the work that urban planners do in cities. And so the property contradiction is the idea that, first of all, there's a tension between the meanings of land. That in one sense, urban land is public, social, right? We walk around outside, we share spaces all the time. That's kind of part of what makes a city a city. But in a capitalist context, it's also private. It's owned by somebody most of the time, unless you're on explicitly public property. And so there's a tension there. But there's also a tension between what those owners of property want from the state and their kind of fear of the state taking over and impinging on their property rights. So they need all sorts of things from government. Of course, they need infrastructure and transportation systems, but they also need education systems. They need their workforce to be educated enough to do the jobs that they're hiring them for. Where it gets interesting, though, is different kinds of capitalists, different kinds of property owners demand different and contradictory things from the state. And so the basic cleavage is between manufacturing capital and real estate capital. Manufacturing capital being the owners of factories and industry and warehouses and other things that are building and moving stuff in cities. And then real estate capital being those who profit off of the buying, selling, and renting of land and buildings themselves. So manufacturing capital generally wants the value of land in a city to stay low. They want to buy it cheap and then they want to build stuff on it. They're not going to so-called improve the land. They're just trying to make stuff and get it out. So they want land to be cheap, and they also kind of want housing to be cheap because they're afraid that if the housing gets expensive, their workforce is going to start demanding higher wages. And so they kind of have a political interest in state interventions that cool speculative land markets and maybe provide some degree of public or affordable housing. They also are against any kind of environmental regulation that's going to get in their way. They want to be able to pollute anywhere, dump anywhere, clog up the air. They don't want the state telling them what to do in that sense. Real estate capital has kind of the inverse relation to all those things. They are not interested in any kind of regulation that's going to lower the value of land, that's going to provide affordable housing or force them to provide affordable housing. But they might be open to certain kinds of environmental regulations that are going to make the land that they own more valuable. If it's cleaner, more people are going to want to live on it. They might even pay more for it. They're not going to want to live next to smoke belching factories. So the manufacturers and the real estate interests are both demanding things of the state, but they're in tension with one another. And so the planners are trying to navigate that tension. They're trying to, as best they can, keep both sides happy and the city's economy humming. At the same time, however, they can't just listen to capital. They have to listen to labor, because we, the working class laborers, are the vast majority of the members of any given society. And in a form of democracy like we have, the state has to remain responsive to people's interests. So they're in trying to resolve the property contradiction between different factions of capital's demands on the state, they enter into that second contradiction you mentioned, which is the capitalist democracy contradiction. How does the planner, how does the state fulfill the needs, the contradictory needs of capitalists, while also genuinely bringing in the participation of the public? And so they develop kind of complex participatory regimes that welcome a certain amount of participation from the public, that democratize certain functions of the state, but they always ensure that there are limits on that participation, there are limits on that power, so that capital is guaranteed its bottom line, so that industrial capital doesn't get such tight environmental regulations that they close up shop, and so that real estate capital doesn't get such tight regulations that they go seek investment opportunities in a different city. So they need us, the people, to participate in order to legitimize the system, but they can't actually turn over the system to us, or else we might demand things that are so bad for the capitalist class that we expropriate their property or we push them out of our area and start doing things for ourselves. So in Richard Fogelsong's kind of theory of how planning works in a capitalist democracy, planners are stuck managing these contradictions. The public has this limited role, and capital is stuck fighting with itself all the time. So rather than this being kind of like a perfectly smooth running machine, it's a constantly in internal crisis system that is always kind of hurting one side to please the other, and vice versa.
How would you say, in the balance of powers right now, it seems like real estate capital is emerging as dominant. I think you even said that earlier in the interview. How does that impact our position as working class people engaging these systems, or, inside of those, managing those contradictions when capital is so consolidated in one sector? How does that show up?
Yeah, it kind of throws this chaotic system out of whack and changes the kind of planning that gets produced. So that theory that I was talking about was published in, I think it was 1986. And it really only covered the period up to the 1920s in the US. By the post-war era, you start to see kind of an industrial reshuffling happening in this country. Not everywhere, but in some places, factories start moving out of the center of the city and toward the periphery. Sometimes they leave the city altogether and they move to the suburbs. This escalates in the 70s, 60s and 70s with factories starting to move to the US South. They want to take advantage of the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, anti-union laws, and they want to build stuff much cheaper in those more deeply exploitive labor conditions. And then following that, in the late 80s, 90s, 2000s, you see companies leaving the South and going to other countries altogether. So yes, there is still manufacturing happening in cities like Minneapolis and in cities like New York, but nowhere near at the scale they were, something, certainly a century ago, but even 50 years ago, 40 years ago. So that has changed how this whole system works. If capital is no longer kind of in tension with itself to the degree that it was, if manufacturing capital isn't there to put a check on real estate capital, then real estate capital has a whole lot more power. What they do is they fill a vacuum that's left by those departing industrial sectors. And that vacuum is literal space that industry used to occupy, that real estate sectors move into, and they kind of convert post-industrial space that was low cost into extremely expensive uses, whether they're commercial or residential. You see real estate kind of taking up the economic space that was there before, filled by manufacturing, at least partially. The new jobs are in finance or insurance or real estate, in moving money around rather than in building stuff and moving it around. And then finally, there is a political vacuum. If manufacturing capital is no longer there, kind of pushing the state to lower land values and provide some degree of affordable housing, then real estate can really run the game and demand higher degrees of luxury development as their primary goal from the state. So that changes the way that planners are going to react to that. And it puts tenants then on kind of the back foot, having to push back against a really powerful segment of capital.
All of that is so instructive for like the struggle that we're engaged in, the development that's kind of the anchor window that we're looking through for this podcast is called the Upper Harbor Terminal. It's 48 acres of riverfront land in North Minneapolis, which was used to be a barge port, an industrial site. It's in, on the river in a very polluted and exploited neighborhood that's traditionally been Black. It's right across the river from the neighborhood I grew up in, Northeast, and that was like the river was a big segregation line between the Black working class and kind of the Eastern European white working class. And after we struggled last winter to try to get the plan brought back to community and get city council to disprove the plan, which is, you know, the city's working with billionaire developers, some of the wealthiest people in the country who are a dominant real estate interest in the city. And what the city did is that we made enough noise where they couldn't ignore us, but then they created a committee, you know, that is presented as this seat for the community at the table, but the committee has to work entirely inside of the mandate set by the developers. It's comical. You know, they were literally told that they could comment on the size of the proposed music venue between the 6,000 and 10,000 frame window that they suggested, but beyond that, they're powerless, you know? So just when I read about that capitalist democracy contradiction, it just really helped clarify what was happening, you know?
Yeah, and it's a real shame because you want people to get involved. You want people to have a say. But if the only choices that they're being given are so far down the line that the fundamentals can't be questioned anymore, it's not always clear what the point of participating is. In some cases, you're really giving legitimacy to a project that you might genuinely oppose through your participation. Sometimes the real power that working class people have in a capitalist society is their power to disrupt things. Whether that's through a strike or through, disruptive protest actions. And you surrender that right when you choose to participate in these formalized mechanisms. And at that point, working class people are always set at a disadvantage. The other side has more power, they have more money, they have more background, they have more access, they have more time. And so it becomes like a deeply uneven playing field that you're operating on. And it can feel empowering sometimes, but often it feels really lonely. And you lose a lot of time and you don't necessarily gain that much.
No, absolutely. I've really seen it fuel kind of cynicism, and it depoliticizes people when you come with good intentions and then you're just so disappointed and the space just feels so dead that it kind of reinforces this idea that it doesn't matter anyway. They're just going to do what they're going to do. So, yeah, and just to think strategically that it's a form of ideological control because it puts disruption kind of beyond the pale or paints disruptors as folks who are negative or don't want anything nice, when in reality it's, you know, understanding that in order to get something nice, we have to be able to assert our class interests, you know? So it's just really helpful to have that framework. I wanted to ask you about geo-bribes. Could you talk about, like, what is geo-bribery and how does it fit into this whole, the gentrification in the real estate state?
Sure. I picked up that term from a theorist out of LA named Ananya Roy. And geo-bribery means geographical bribery. And it's when the state, the government, incentivizes development in particular locations by giving away the store, by reducing regulations, be they environmental regulations or labor regulations, by cutting taxes, by providing all sorts of free infrastructure that is paid for by public money in order to get investment in a particular location. And it's gotten to the point where this is more the rule than the exception. And developers just sort of expect these kind of giveaways if they're going to invest in any place. And because of the competitive nature of capitalism as it's mapped onto the geography of cities, if one city refuses to play the game, another city will redouble their efforts. Unless there's some sort of regional solidarity or national or international solidarity, it becomes very hard for any one city or any one neighborhood even to take a stand and say, we refuse to give out these geo-bribes. And then once it becomes expected, this is something that somebody else, Dan Denver, pointed out to me, it becomes not geo-bribery, but geo-extortion. It's the real estate developers extorting the city to say, you better give us these things or we're going to walk away. And the most extreme example of that in recent years was Amazon's national contest for their second headquarters, where they encouraged every city to present their geo-bribes to them in the form of secret plans that only they would see before the public would see them. And then they could select which city worked best for them. So that's kind of like the most extreme, even absurd version of this phenomenon, but it happens at a lesser scale all the time.
Absolutely. What's ironic is, or cruel, is the site that the Upper Harbor Terminal sits on. The developer in one of the meetings revealed that they actually wrote some blueprints and considered applying for the Amazon headquarters there. And our mayor here was a real aggressive proponent of participating in that, just like Hunger Games. I'm glad. I don't think somehow it fell through where I don't think Minneapolis was in the process too long, but it's just a really sad state of affairs.
It is. I think that's the right word. It's sad. It's sad to watch our cities kind of demean themselves to the world's richest man in order to get things that we deserve and need anyway, as in jobs and housing and the stuff that makes a city livable. It shouldn't have to be this way.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to go back to, I want to keep this thread of kind of housing policy and land use policy. Minneapolis has been in the news. I don't know if you've seen some of these pieces, but we're being celebrated for eliminating single family zoning. You know, this was like a huge policy win for our current administration. And there's a kind of a strong contingent of liberals that talk about upzoning being both the best way to bring the rent down and really frame the issue in terms of supply and demand. Can you talk about your view on upzoning, like how you've seen upzoning work in other contexts? And then you touched on it already earlier, but again, just in the context of zoning, how the kind of liberal supply and demand narrative misses the mark or doesn't tell the whole story.
Mm-hmm. This is something I'm trying to think through right now and maybe present in a more nuanced way than I did in parts of the book, because different cities have different histories of zoning. And so just as the sort of one size fits all upzone everything narrative doesn't make sense, we have to be very clear that leaving things the way they are is also not a good option. In just about every place, the zoning that we have was produced through processes that anybody on the left should reject wholeheartedly. So in saying that, I question the logic of some of these things, it's not to say that therefore the status quo is the way to go. So the way that it's played out in New York City, which is the city that I live in and the place that I write about the most in the book, even though I try to make it relevant to a lot of different cities, we've had this dynamic over the last almost 20 years now, where we've had a lot of rezonings. Under the last mayor, Michael Bloomberg, who's now running for president, about a third of the entire city's landmass was rezoned, not all at once, but through something like 140 different small neighborhood rezonings. Then under the current mayor, Bill de Blasio, who already lost his race for the president, he rezoned the entire, or changed the rules for the entire city, but then initiated a series of rezonings to kind of make that real. And rezonings are always complicated things. Certain areas get upzoned or targeted for increased development capacity. Certain areas get either downzoned or contextually zoned, so either freezing in place what's there or making future development smaller than the present development. And it's always kind of a mix of them combined. But the overall pattern that we saw and we continue to see in the city is the wealthier and whiter the area, the more likely it was to get a downzoning, a protective rezoning that would keep in place the size and features of the built environment. And the more working class and the more percentage people of color lived in an area, the greater chance that it would be upzoned or zoned for increased development capacity. So what we've done over the last 20 years, and really deeper than that in New York City, is channel real estate development into the areas that are most affordable right now and away from the areas that are most expensive. And if you wanted to make the argument that, well, New York City's population is growing, we can't have our housing stock be stagnant, we need to grow it, or else wealthier people are just going to kind of outbid working class people from the housing that exists, you can make that argument. But there's no reason that we should channel the development to the place where people can't afford to live right now. It makes much more sense to channel that development toward the places that are exclusionary, are wealthy, but are well connected to the subways and have good schools and have all those other things. So we've done the exact opposite of what would be a sensible approach to making our housing stock meet our growth. The other piece that's missing in that I alluded to before is we often don't pay attention to who is moving to our cities and what kind of housing do they need. So while some kind of obvious, wealthy, annoying people are moving to the center of many cities, most city growth is still working class immigrants, often transnational immigrants. That's the case in New York City. I bet it's the case in Minneapolis. Yeah, and so building up a bunch of new luxury housing doesn't meet the new demand. It meets a demand. It meets the demand of that narrower band of wealthy people who can buy anything they want. It meets the demand of investors for new opportunities for growth, but it doesn't meet the actual housing demands of the people who most are suffering under the current conditions. And so it's just too simple to say, build more of any kind of housing anywhere and the rents everywhere else will go down. That's not the case. It's also too simple to say, no development anywhere and rents will go down as a result. That's not true either. There are ways to do this, but very few cities have had the political will to kind of make the wealthy pay their share of the kind of need for new housing construction, and instead have placed that burden on those who are struggling and suffering at the moment.
Yeah, I'm trying to limit my reflections in response because we don't have a ton of time, but I just think the nuance is really important. There's a really ugly and violent history of racial exclusion. You talked about redlining, and restricted covenants in Minneapolis, and that very much needs to be addressed and put to the forefront. And I think the single family zoning had a part to play in that. It tends to be that those neighborhoods are those exclusively zoned neighborhoods. But I think there's a way that I've seen that real racial justice critique kind of be co-opted when there's like just this idea that no matter what, upzoning is a racial justice policy, and ignoring the dynamics where you're talking about some of the neighborhoods with the highest rent gaps. And if the only type of housing you're prepared to deliver is on the private market with the same developers who have been building all this luxury, you're really poised to do more violence and damage to people of color. And, it's people of color who are in working class, white people too, but there's a racial dynamic to who's being displaced. So I appreciate the nuance, and I think we got to keep talking it out here in Minneapolis. I wanted to go ahead.
Just say real quick, we on the left don't want to get in the defensive position of being against what's being offered to us and therefore defending the status quo.
Absolutely.
It's a losing proposition. We need to be presenting alternatives all the time. That's hard work. It takes imagination and commitment and time and effort and everything else. But there's a real danger to preserving the status quo out of opposition to the change that's being offered, because the status quo was the last generation's, class compromise and exploitation.
Yeah, absolutely. That being said, I want to steer us in a future-oriented and kind of talk a bit about our desires and needs as working class people. I really like that you followed up your critique with, talking about the organizing that's happening in New York City. And I wanted to read what you share in the book from New York City is Not for Sale, their 5-point platform. Number 1 is end homelessness. Number 2 is universal rent control. Number 3 is transfer distressed buildings into public ownership. Number 4 is repair and expand high quality public housing. and number 5 is democratic development. So I just kind of wanted to say that out loud for the listeners, that there's people presenting positive visions, and see if you have any responses or embellishments or any reflections on that platform and other organizing you're seeing that's inspiring you.
Yeah, that is I think a really interesting platform because of how the people who presented it built on what exists and presented an alternative. So each of those 5 points takes something that already exists in the city, but pushes you to imagine it actually being complete. So we have homeless shelters in New York City. We do not have an end to homelessness in New York City. We even have a right to shelter, constitutionally provided. We do not have a right to housing. And so this is pushing people to think like, okay, we have this thing because we recognize that there's a problem. How would we actually go about changing the city enough that that problem didn't exist anymore? The same with universal rent control. We have partial rent control in New York City. What's the justification for not making it universal? We have programs to take away buildings from landlords if they're basically going to kill their tenant, even though in my case, the landlord killed the tenant, kept the building because the building survived the assault. And then the same goes with public housing. New York City, as with Minneapolis, we have a public housing stock. It is the alternative to the private model. The troubles that it's going through are a result of decades of disinvestment, not with the idea of public housing itself. We can, dramatically expand that if we have the tools to do so. And then finally, democratizing development. We have procedures to participate in development processes like we talked about before, but they're so limited and partial. And so it's worth thinking about what would it mean to have what one of my mentors, Peter Marcuse, used to call progressive community control. Not community control in that every community gets to control its own community, because that would just result in the wealthy people holding on to their wealth and excluding everybody else. But instead inverting that so that those who have control of their neighborhoods right now lose it, and those who are at the whim of the market right now gain control of their communities.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I think it's a good almost thought experiment for anybody in any city to say, what do we have right now, and what would it take for that program to actually do the thing that it's promising to do?
Are you familiar with Greg Russ, who's coming to be the director of NYCHA?
I've heard. I've heard that there were some problems.
Yeah, he's coming from here. So it'll be interesting to keep the dialogue going, but, really came here on a mission of privatization, and he really caused a lot of injury here where Minneapolis right now is in the midst of one of the most aggressive Section 18 demolition and disposition, privatizing of scattered site public housing. Like our mayor and city council presidents, the same folks who are, celebrating the new zoning changes, wrote a letter to Ben Carson advocating that they approve this, they applied for 100% of the units to be privatized. And there's a really inspiring campaign here, the Defend Glendale and Keep Public Housing public campaign, that is leading the fight against that. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how Greg Russ is greeted out there.
Yeah, people are definitely aware and skeptical. I mean, the first scandal was just how much he's getting paid, but
how much is it?
I don't remember offhand, but it's a lot of money. But in some ways, that's a bit of a distraction. The real issue is that he's being brought in to do in New York City what he accomplished in Minneapolis. The plan in New York City is to privatize about 60% of our public housing, which is nuts. But to think that he got away with a plan for 100% is terrifying.
Yeah, it really is. Do you got time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions?
Sure.
I'm really interested in the idea that you put forward at the end of the book of radical regionalism. Some of the organizing I do is inside of kind of the nonprofit industrial complex, and there's this idea of hyper-localism, which I think in certain ways is really powerful and can be effective. But then this idea of radical regionalism, it really kind of touched a spot in me where I was starting to question our hyper-local focus in some of the work that I do. Could you just talk about that? What is radical regionalism, and how does that offer us some possibility of transformation?
Yeah, there's a long history of regional thinking in urban planning, which goes pretty much across the political spectrum. There's a conservative version of regionalism, there's a liberal version of regionalism, and there's a left or radical version of regionalism. Obviously, that's the one that I'm a proponent of. The idea is to think beyond the kind of arbitrary boundaries of municipal politics, whether that's the community districts that are drawn within a city, whether that's the city line or the state line even, and to think about what scale do various things actually happen at. You know, our environment is not a local phenomenon, and if we have all the best environmental programs in one small area, it's not going to change global warming or any of the other environmental concerns that we have. Watersheds exist at particular geographic scales that don't necessarily map onto municipal or state boundaries. But also commuting patterns don't necessarily fit in those boundaries either. People live in one place and they work in another. Education boundaries are drawn at the school district level, but maybe they don't match where those commuting patterns are, and they have nothing to do with the environmental relations between where food is produced and where it's consumed. So regionalism in general is a way of thinking beyond those boundaries. I actually think Minneapolis, if I remember correctly, has a history of instituting some of this so that there was some cross-city suburban sharing.
Yeah. I'm realizing, I think what you're referring to is the Met Council. We have a body that's elected or are appointed representatives of the 7-county metro area. And then there's like also a county layer of the kind of municipal infrastructure that is different than the city. So it's given me reason to look into kind of how those bodies got developed.
Yeah, and that's basically like the liberal vision of regionalism,
right?
Which is better than not having it, but there's a lot more that we can do. And the radical version says a few things. First of all, borders are arbitrary and international solidarity is more important than anything else.
Hell yeah.
So that's as true at the local level, though, as it is at the international level. Like, if we are workers of the world, then we're going to have to unite it at every scale.
Yeah.
And that means not just in the most local of ways. It's also getting rid of a kind of scalar fetishism that says small good, big bad, local good, international bad, and that says actually we are living in a world that needs change at every scale. And so the regional might be kind of the way that we can think about the intermediate between the personal and the global. And then finally, it's a way of undoing this really terrible bind that we're in that is a structural feature of neoliberalism in the US anyway, where local governments are increasingly responsible for paying for all sorts of stuff, whether it's housing, social housing, mass transit, but they have less and less control over how they can spend that money. So it used to be that the federal government put in a lot more money toward those things, and local governments had a lot of say in what they could do with it. They didn't always make good choices, but they had more local power. At this point, the federal government and state governments exert a lot of power over restricting what we cities can do in spending on those things. And they also make us pay for more of them at the local level. So that's kind of like the worst version of a local, state, and federal funding dynamic that we can imagine, but it's the one we're stuck with. So regionalism is a way of breaking out of that bind that separates those multiple levels, that disempowers cities to make like innovative decisions around planning questions, and also forces those federal bodies that actually have the money to pay for things like public housing and mass transit expansions to pay up.
Yeah, I love it. And even to think of like, the dynamics of gentrification is like a lot of poor people or a lot of the folks I grew up with, they already moved to the suburbs or they're already in the exurbs. So the idea of like thinking of us as a class and not getting caught up in that urban suburban dynamic or competition, I feel like the idea of regionalism kind of opens me up to that. Do you have any thoughts about the 2020 primary, any of the candidates and any of the way those policies impact, our conversation around gentrification?
Sure. I support Bernie Sanders, so that's an easy one for me. I would love to see somebody even further to the left of him, but there's really no question which candidate comes the closest to my own views. And I think it's worth looking at his housing and Green New Deal plans in particular, which really prioritize public housing, rent control, and going after speculation, both as means of fighting back against gentrification and as ways to develop a post-carbon future. I think that he is actually proposing the scale of change that we need to see. It's not clear exactly how Congress as we know it is going to enact those things. That's a different question, but at least it's getting the analysis right of what's wrong with the current situation and is pointing to a vision that is bold enough to actually make the kind of changes we need rather than tinkering around the edges.
Hell yeah. Is there anything else, like anything you want to point our listeners to, or since the book drop, a project that you're working on that you're excited about that you'd like to add to the mix?
Well, readers who are interested, please do check out the book. Check out my other articles in Jacobin Magazine and Progressive City Magazine, various other places. You can look at my website, shapeofthecity.blogspot.com, for a full list of my publications, and keep fighting.
Hell yeah. Thanks so much. This was really great. Really appreciate you. Thanks for joining us. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep them coming. Bands building